So I lived with Father Rob Ketchum, who was the chaplain at St. John the Baptist for a number of years, and he was telling me about this guy who's, I guess, been an up-and-coming musical artist, and his name is Hobo Johnson. I never heard of this guy before, and I think he's like a good snapshot of modernity. This guy whose music kind of ranges everywhere from like hip-hop to sort of heavy metal to kind of generic pop, and the lyrics are pretty dark and heavy, and it's just kind of like all over the place, completely unhinged from like anything that keeps it all together. And one of his song lyrics goes something like, "Have you put us here to die? Have you put us here to die?" This kind of prayer to God that comes out of a place of darkness and despair. And like how so much of like modernity, so much of what so many people are going through is like feeling almost like an orphan, like a spiritual orphan. If you ever have encountered anybody who actually like grew up as an orphan without like a mom or a dad or a real home, it's kind of like this mentality all the time of like, I gotta take care of myself, nobody else is looking out for me, I gotta be tough, I gotta be self-sufficient, and kind of have that little bit of edginess about themselves. And I think you see that with so much of modernity, with so many people today. Like, I gotta keep it all together. And I think if you honestly ask them, you kind of pull them aside like, hey, is everything okay? I think honestly they would say like, no, something is really seriously wrong. I got to look out for myself, and I got to be self-sufficient, and deep down I know that it's almost kind of like living a lie, and it's this kind of place of pain out of which I operate. But I think about that guy Hobo Johnson. I think about that kind of dark song lyric, have you put us here to die? And I think about the 22nd Psalm that we heard sung before, and that Jesus intones from the cross, my God, why have you forsaken me? It's like Jesus, through his passion, death, and resurrection, who shows us that, like in so many ways, he has been orphaned by the world, but he's never been orphaned by the Father. He's like abandoned by the world, but he's never been abandoned by the Father. I propose to you guys 3 ways that Jesus is abandoned by the world. He's orphaned by the world. The world has no place for him. You guys know, like, the Passion accounts, they recount 3 different trials that Jesus faces before his passion and death. 3 different trials. There's the trial with the Sanhedrin, the Jewish authority, the religious authority. There's the trial with Pilate, the Roman procurator, the chief politician of the day and age. And then there's the trial by King Herod. Herod, who is kind of the sensual man, whose palace probably resembled something along the lines of a first-century Playboy mansion. So these 3 different trials. We have the religious trial, the political trial, and the sensual trial. Jesus faces all of them, and in all of them, he's abandoned by these 3 different trials. He's rejected by these 3 different trials. For the religious authority, the religious trial, he's too divine. He's put to death for blasphemy. He says, I'm the Son of God. The authorities, they see what he's done. They saw him raise the dead. They saw him raise Lazarus. In John's Gospel, Caiaphas, the chief priest, the head of the Sanhedrin, after Lazarus is raised from the dead, he says, whoa, this is getting too serious. This is going to raise some attention. This is going to put some bad optics on us. The Romans might try to squash us down after this. We have to stop this. And I'm sure that was tied in with a little bit of envy as well. These religious authority, how they're kind of being superseded by this random preacher from nowhere in Galilee. So envy and jealousy, and also a sense of just covering themselves and trying to protect themselves. And for the religious authority, Jesus is too divine. He shows the works of the Father. He shows these works that only God can do. He says who he is, and they refuse to believe him. And how kind of appropriate that is for our own day and age as well, when so many people, and so many even in places of religious authority, we think about all the scandals in the church for the last better part of 20 years now. How many priests, bishops live as if they were practical atheists with no fear of God, with no fear of judgment or having to give an account for how they exercise their authority. We think about so many of our brothers and sisters who, profess the Catholic faith in word, but then kind of live and go the way of the world with how they live their lives. They live as if they were atheists, as if there was kind of no even basic fear of God for how they live. For the religious authority, Jesus is too divine. He's too divine. And the religious authority as well, they kind of get into the first century equivalent of political correctness. It's these same guys who they charge Jesus with blasphemy. They go before Pontius Pilate just a little bit later, and they say the ultimate act of apostasy: we have no king but Caesar. We have no king but Caesar. To try to keep everything nicey nice, but completely divorce and abandon themselves from the truth and from that sacred covenant that God entered into with his people, his chosen people, Israel. That the hypocrisy we see with the religious authority, and Jesus is too divine for them. And then we see the trial with Pontius Pilate, the political trial. Pilate, the Roman procurator. In John's Gospel, Pilate asked Jesus, "What is truth?" in response to Jesus saying, "All who hear my voice hear the truth." Pilate asks with a cynicism that resonates with us today, what is truth? Quid est veritas? What is truth? For the political authority, Jesus is too honest. He's too truthful. Jesus, who is the light of the world, Jesus who lives completely in the light that the darkness of the world can't overcome. For those who live in the shadows, he's a threat. For those who live in lies, those who enforce their power through lies, Jesus is too much of a threat. And Pilate, with a complete lack of integrity, he knows Jesus is innocent. He knows he hasn't done what the chief priest, the Sanhedrin, is accusing him of doing. He knows that there's no real cause for this man to be put to death, but because he's too honest, because he's too good, and because it would be too much of a mess to do the right thing, he cops out and he sells out. Pilate, in this act of cowardice, refusing to have a shred of integrity, completely sells out the truth himself. And then we have the sensual trial, the trial with Herod. When Pilate learns that Jesus is, from Galilee, from Judea, he's not my subject. Send him to Herod. Let Herod take care of this mess. I don't want to deal with it. And then when Jesus goes to Herod, Herod knows of Jesus. He's heard of Jesus. He's the same Herod who put John the Baptist to death because Herod was called out by John for taking his brother's wife and it being unlawful. We live in this world where the senses have run amok. We're enslaved to the senses. Herod shows this in so many ways. We live in a day and age when so many ideologies that are contrary to the natural law, to the teaching of the gospel of Jesus Christ, are aggressively being pushed in our face, and even more aggressively now have infiltrated the church and have even been pushed upon the church from the secular authorities in our own day and age. And this enslavement to the senses that Jesus is faced with here, Herod asked Jesus, show us a sign, show us a miracle. Let's see what you really got. And not because the Lord is incapable of doing so, but because that request comes nowhere near from a place of faith or real honesty or authenticity, Christ remains silent. We think about how Jesus in the gospel in the Beatitudes says, "Blessed are the pure of heart, for they shall see God." It's unless we're pure of heart, it's almost impossible, if not it is impossible, to see God, to have a real relationship with him. We all struggle in our own ways or whatever, but, Herod's not even interested in trying to enter into the struggle to grow in relationship or to be open to the possibility of Christ being who he really says he is. For Herod, he's so far enslaved into the senses. He's so far gone that he's just completely shut his own heart from anything to the contrary. I think about King Herod. I think about how there's a holy nemesis that Herod has in St. Augustine, who was a man who lived enslaved to the senses and enslaved to a life of lust. St. Augustine, the future father of the church, doctor of the church, who, before he became a priest and a bishop, really lived the rock and roll lifestyle of the 4th century, even fathering a child out of wedlock before he entered into holy orders. St. Augustine, who prayed when he was enslaved to a life of the senses and to lust, he prayed, Lord, give me chastity, but not now. talk about an interesting prayer coming from a doctor of the church, a saint of the church. This enslavement to the senses, how Jesus is too pure. Jesus is found too pure for the sensual trial. In all these ways, Jesus is orphaned by the world. He's too divine, he's too honest and truthful, and he's too pure for the world. He's orphaned by the world, but he's never orphaned by the Father. And you know that line that Jesus intones from the 22nd Psalm, my God, why have you forsaken me? He enters into that ancient Jewish custom of beginning a psalm and calling to mind, by beginning it, really calling to mind the entirety of the psalm. Psalm 22 begins with a place of desolation, a cry of feeling abandoned by God, but it ends with confidence and praise in God. The God who will make all the nations of the world worship the one God of Israel. How God is always at work in the good and the bad and the ugly. How the 22nd Psalm anticipates what St. Paul said when St. Paul said, God makes all things work for the good of those who love him. Jesus enters into this drama, and Jesus in himself fulfills this prophetic word of the 22nd Psalm, that all the nations of the world will worship the God of Israel in and through Christ, when he's raised up on the cross and draws all men to himself. Jesus enters into this orphan state of desolation that so many of us feel ourselves abandoned by God and the world. He enters into it. He knows everything of what it is to be human except sin itself, and he becomes sin for our sake. Jesus, who becomes like an orphan, but knows that he is never orphaned by the Father. Like the Lord shows us so powerfully on the cross that God comes so close to us to meet us wherever we're at, even if it's in the darkest place imaginable. But he loves us too much to leave us there. So we pray for that grace in this Holy Eucharist, that, entering into that loneliness of the Lord, of feeling in so many ways abandoned by God and overwhelmed by suffering and evil, that while we may be orphaned by the world, our Heavenly Father will never ever abandon us. And that state of desolation and despair we may be on the precipice of, how it's the Lord himself who brings us from that into confidence that God makes everything work for the good of those who love him.